I mean, when you read this, is this a substantive legal document, or is it, I mean, as Megyn and Caitlin are saying, a lot of public relations?
I think it's a lot of public relations. In fact, it is so weak that the law they rely on, first, they don't even cite it properly in their brief, but it's U.S. versus Nixon, they claim gives a presumptive privilege to all presidential documents. Well, that's nonsense. If they'd read the case, that's citing a Court of Appeals agreement, and then the Supreme Court immediately marches away from that and says there is no such privilege presumption. In fact, it is subject to the rule of law, which embraces grand jury information of this nature. So it is a PR document. That's all it is.
Judge, have you ever seen a filing like this? I mean, is it, as these filings go, how does it relate to others you've seen?
I don't even know where to begin. Have I ever seen anything like this? First of all, there is a search warrant affidavit in which an FBI agent has sworn to facts on which the probable cause and on which the search was based. There are pages and pages in this document in which they're just saying stuff, not sworn to. They're just making statements, that on their face someone needs to swear to, and I imagine there was some concern about swearing to any of this. And as John Dean was saying, there's no presumption of privilege here. It's really just the opposite. The documents that were in those boxes, first of all, presumably match the scope of the warrant, which was then based on probable cause, and are covered by the Presidential Records Act or classified documents. So, I think this is a PR move and nothing more.
Maggie, do you have a sense of what the team, who is around the former president? Who is involved in these sorts of, how do things get decided in Trump world right now? Who are his attorneys? What's the process?
Look, at the end of the day, Donald Trump is always first and foremost his own advisor on everything, and that includes legal issues. He is obviously not a lawyer, so people can do with that what they will. He likes to find lawyers who will do what he wants. But he has been the person, as I understand it, who was slow on wanting to do anything. He has a handful of lawyers around him in various cases, Anderson. Remember, this is not the only legal front he is fighting on. One is a man named Evan Corcoran, who was present on June 3rd when federal officials came, counterintelligence officials came from the Justice Department and retrieved additional classified material that was still there. He has a lawyer named Jim Trusty. He has a few others. But there are a lot of lawyers who have told him or told his team they don't want to represent him. He is notorious for not paying his bills. He is notorious for not following advice. So, it didn't matter so much, Anderson. He had a different group of lawyers. I should just point that out when he was in the White House, a very different group, number one. But number two, when he had the power of the presidency behind him and essentially the state, for lack of a better way of looking at it, was investigating him, he still was the state. And so it was just a different position. He is not in that position right now. And we don't know where this is leading. We don't know if there will be charges. We know at the moment it appears to be about the documents. But he is in a very different position than we've seen him in, I think, ever.
John Dean, we've seen defenders of the former president kind of put out every kind of reason for why he would have classified documents sitting in a storage unit at Mar-a-Lago. I just want to play something that Kash Patel, the former chief of staff to the acting defense secretary, Christopher Miller, in the waning days of the Trump administration said.
In October of 2020, President Trump put out for the world to see a sweeping declassification order, and he did it via social media. And then in December and January, on the way out, I witnessed him declassify whole sets of documents. So it is not incumbent upon President Trump and his lawyers and him as a target of this investigation to show he, in fact, did declassify them. It's up to the government, who has the burden of proof, who are trying to deprive a man of his liberty, to show that no such order was, in fact, given.
John, does any of that make sense to you? Do you see any kind of coherent legal strategy in all this?
It's a public relations strategy. Again, it's not a legal strategy. It's questionable if he did anything that would have declassified the documents that are relevant here.
Right, there would be a paper trail.
Subject to the search. there would be a paper trail, and the documents would have been marked as declassified, and the rest of the world would have been told they were declassified because they're not isolated documents. They're typically multiple copies. They're logged. They're careful care. That's how they knew they were missing, because these documents are logged everywhere and their whereabouts is known.
Yeah.
So this is, I think what Mr. Patel is doing is getting himself a front row seat at the grand jury, where he'll be testifying very soon under oath, and we'll hear what his story is later.
I just want to bring one more person in the conversation because our panel boxes are not big enough. CNN's chief political commentator and former Obama senior advisor, David Axelrod. David, what does the former president potentially gain or lose by requesting a special master and prolonging the process?
Well, as has been said by others squeezed into these boxes, I do think it is a lot about politics and public relations. I think that it implies that there is something untoward about the materials that were taken, that they may be being used in ways that are inappropriate. You know, I don't want to use the word spying, but that's what the conspiracy theorists think, that, you know, the FBI went and seized the president's documents. As the judge pointed out, these aren't his documents. These documents belong to the American people. I remember how rigorous the presidential records process was when I was in the White House, and you know, so the whole thing is absurd. And by the way, Patel in that same interview was asked, you know, about the process of declassifying. He says, "Well, the president just says it, and then they're declassified." And they say, "Well, says it to who?" And he says, "Well, you know, a witness." And it was, I mean, the whole thing was absurd. So I don't know that. I think the advantage is political in his mind,
David,
Anderson.
There's also this new NBC poll where it asks, do you consider yourself to be more of a supporter of Donald Trump or more of a supporter of the Republican Party? The former president's numbers have actually gone up since May from 34% to 41%, whereas general support for the Republican Party has gone down. Do you think these investigations are helping the former president?
Well, they may be helping him within his base within the Republican Party. I think it's riled them up. It's not helping him overall. His numbers are not improving overall. And 57% of the American people in that poll said they think these investigations should continue. And I think the fact that Republicans are begging him not to announce his candidacy for president until after November because they think it will hurt their candidates tells you everything. He is an albatross around the Republican Party now, even as he's strong within the Republican Party.
Well, to all my friends in tiny boxes, David Axelrod, Caitlin Collins, Maggie Haber, and Nancy Gertner, John Dean, thank you very much. Appreciate it.